Well, hello everybody, it's Pastor Kurt, and I'm so glad that you are tuning in this morning to Restoration Church Online. We are so excited to start a brand new conversation for the month of May that we're going to be in, discussing some of the crazy stuff that Jesus said. We're actually going to be looking through the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, a section of Scripture often referred to as the Beatitudes. And what's funny to me is, for many of us, if we've ever heard of the Sermon on the Mount, like as a communicator, this is Jesus's very first message. It's the very first thing that he really delivers a full sermon to his followers. And so we thought it would be fun and also kind of ironic that as we are here sheltering in place, doing church online, perhaps the most convenient church delivery system that you could ever have, we are going to be exploring perhaps what was the most inconvenient message that Jesus ever delivered. And so for the next 5 weeks, as we kind of come together each gathering, I hope that you'll be able to kind of lean in and that you would allow the Spirit of God to speak to you over these next few weeks together in a way that might illuminate something new, might challenge some assumptions you might have had, and really hopefully for all of us, draw us closer to Jesus, as our mission says, of empowering all people to love and follow Jesus, that we would actually follow him a little bit closer. See, as we read this beginning of this scripture that we're going to start in just a few minutes, we recognize that what Jesus brings to front and center at the very beginning of his time teaching on this planet, for those followers that were gathered around him, was that how he anticipated life to go with them, what he valued, the kind of like core tenets of this new community that he was trying to create, that was kind of birthing around him and because of him, that it was going to be very different than what anybody had expected or really seen before. And it's so perfect that we're kind of going through and having this conversation together at this time when everything about your life and mine is different and upside down and inside out than what we are used to or what we are expecting. And for many of us, I know these last 6 weeks that we have been kind of in some form or another of a closed down societal life, that things have changed so quickly and so drastically. It has really brought about and really brought to the surface some deep frustration, some deep brokenness, some grief that many of us didn't even realize that we might have been carrying into this season, or definitely has emerged because of this season. And so I'm actually very hopeful that our conversation today, for many of you, I know it has for me as I've studied for this, will bring some hope and to bring some levity and to not take away any of the pain that you might be experiencing, or the grief you might be going through, the challenges that we are all facing together as a community, but will bring a new lens, a new way of looking at this situation, a new perspective. Because as we look to the person of Jesus, he is for sure the central figure in history. Every time you write a date, 2020, as much as we have not loved this year, is marking a time since his time on the planet. And the reason that he is so central is not just because after he was on the planet, people decided to make him a big deal, but that when he was here, when he was walking around Israel and Palestine, as he was teaching and being around people, the things that he did and the things that he said often were so bombastic and so out there and so different than what they had heard up to that point, especially from anyone claiming to be talking about God, that people just kind of leaned in to hear, just to be curious, just to check it out. And you and I, we're the same way, right? That even if we don't really believe something, we kind of tend to lean in and listen when someone says something outlandish or different than what we had heard before. Even if we know it can't be true, or at least we don't think it can be true, even if it's so different than what we might expect, we love to watch the news and watch things that we don't even agree with, because it's just, what's he going to say today? We love late night comedy shows because they love to kind of put a spin on things that's different than what you would expect to hear. It is something that is true in all of us. And Jesus, as the master communicator and as the Son of God, combines this thing that's true about you and me, that he says things in a way that was so simple and yet so challenging, So we hope as we look to this section of Scripture together over the next 5 weeks, that you would realize, that I would realize, that what Jesus said is actually pretty crazy. What he invites us into is so far beyond what maybe we would have expected, and yet something about it is so inviting and so alluring and so ringing so true to who we are and who we hope God is. And so the reality that I want to bring to us today is that when we come to the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has no intro, he has no funny story, he has no hook to kind of connect with people's lives. He just dives right into it and he starts talking about brokenness. And for many of us in this season, we look around our world, we look around our own life, we look around even our families 6 weeks into quarantine, and we know that there is brokenness not just around us, but within us. And oftentimes we can wonder, how does God feel about that? In fact, in his time, G.K. Chesterton, who's a renowned theologian, was asked by the London Times to kind of give his perspective, along with many of his contemporaries, as to what he thought the problem was with the world in his day. And many of his contemporaries were scholars and Oxford and Rhodes Scholars, and all these people wrote in their thoughts. And he wrote in one sentence to the London Times. He wrote, "The problem with the world is the problem within me. I am the problem with the world." And as we bring ourselves to this text today, there's something about all of us, something about you and something about me, that it's pretty easy to admit, I'm not all of who I wish I was, and you probably aren't either. And there's nothing like being locked in your house for 6 weeks to bring that out of you, right? It's like, oh man, that habit, that tendency, that temper, that short fuse, that thing that I go to when I'm stressed, I don't even like that about myself. And the reality is that Jesus wanted to make it so clear from the very beginning of his teaching, as he invited people up to this mountainside to teach, that he was not just okay with our brokenness, but in fact our brokenness actually brings his blessing. That Jesus is not just okay with our brokenness. He doesn't just turn a blind eye to it or give us a little pat on the back so you'll do better next time. Actually, it is our very brokenness that draws out, that brings his blessing. See, we can look to the Sermon on the Mount, and often, if we're honest, we kind of go, oh, golf clap, like that's a great message. But this is such a radical invitation, and it was so different in the first century, and it's so different in our life now, where we love to make much of ourselves. We love to believe that we're smarter, that we can do it, that we can try again and get it right this time, and all of that stuff is fine and good. But Jesus speaks to something so true in our soul that when we are at the end of ourselves, what do we do with that? And so he starts in Matthew 5. And again, he's just come out of being tempted by the devil. And instead of going to where the people are, people just surround him. And he goes on a hike. And we go, oh, Sermon on the Mount. And we can picture him on like this quiet, easy hill. You know, if you've ever been to the Middle East, you know, there's not a whole lot of easy hiking trails on that part of the Mediterranean rim. And so most likely, similar to this, he asked his followers that wanted to hear him teach, hey, hike up a big hill with me. Like, this is going to cost you something to even get to the beginning of my ministry. And then when they got there, they finally took a rest and maybe, got their breath and started listening to Jesus teach. He says this, one day as he saw all the crowds gathering, he went up on the mountainside, right? He's kind of cutting off those people that were just barely interested. You had to really want to follow him. And he sits down on the side of the mountain, and all of his disciples, right, the people that had made it that far, said, I'm really going to follow you, Jesus, even up this mountain. They're gathered around him, and he began to teach them, and he starts off saying this, God blesses those who are poor in spirit and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who are poor in spirit and says theirs, like those kinds of people, that's who the kingdom of heaven belongs to. And then he goes on and says, God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. This is like the opening line of his very first sermon. And so these people that are gathered around, as many of you might feel this morning, given the last 6 weeks that we've lived together, that you might be wondering, man, I just don't feel like I have a lot to offer. I feel like my emotional, spiritual, certainly social bank account is pretty close to zero. And Jesus would say, you know what? You're in great company. That actually the kingdom of God belongs to you. that you are invited to be a participant and a contributor and to be close and near to what God is doing in the world. And then Jesus continues, and again, this is the second sentence in his very first sermon. He brings up a topic that many of us have avoided our entire life, certainly not talked about very openly in public. He brings up grief. He says that God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And what this pandemic and the social distancing and the stay-at-home orders has done for many of us, it has bubbled up to the surface some very real griefs that we have been carrying, some grief from long ago, and even new grief that we've had to deal with. Losses that we have really have to name or have yet to name, and what that has done to our psyche and to our soul and to our relationships. And Jesus brings to the forefront right away, he goes, you've heard a lot of other rabbis, a lot of other teachers, to his first century audience, and I think to you and to me as well. There's plenty of people that offer different kinds of teaching. You want to follow Jesus, you got to understand, Jesus says that it's okay to bring your full self, even your grieving self. That in fact, God blesses those who mourn with his comfort, directly or intangibly through others. And so he not only is speaking about God, but he's looking around to these followers saying, all right, you've made it up the hill with me. This is the kind of community we're going to be. We're going to be the kind of community that comes around one another when we're mourning, that grieves with. And again, this was much more common in first century Jewish culture than it is for most of us in our modern Western culture right now. But even still, the idea of communal grief is such an important concept that we have to reclaim and regain access to, because Jesus knew something about you and something about me that we know but we pretend isn't true or doesn't apply to us, and that is that unprocessed grief actually leads to an unfulfilled life. There are many times in different places, some that are very meta and major, and others that seem minute and small, but they play into our life, where an unprocessed grief, an unnamed and processed loss can lead later to a demolition of a relationship or a loss of a job. That there are people that that they worked really, really hard to impress their boss, really, really hard to go the extra mile, to do extra things, and something inside of them, when they didn't get the promotion that they thought they were going to be entitled to because of the way they were working, they never named that frustration, named that loss, named that grief. And later it led to a distance in their relationship with their boss, their supervisor. It maybe ended them leaving the company and going somewhere else. It may have them choose a different career altogether. As a parent, there are times when you wished your kid behaved a certain way or liked a certain thing that you liked when you were a kid. And if we don't name the fact that, hey, my son might not like the same things that I liked when I was his age, and that needs to be okay, but to name that was a expectation or a hope that wasn't fulfilled, that's a grief to name that and to process that. Otherwise, I'll never be fulfilled in what he is passionate about or what your son is passionate about. That for many of us, even when it comes to spaces with God, when life doesn't go our way and situations don't turn out the way that we thought, or people that claim to be all about God don't treat us the way we thought that they should, if we don't process those griefs, we will end up living an unfulfilled life. Because the reality is that every loss, every change has a grief attached to it. And you and I, known by the Son of God as he was teaching his very first message, we know that there's something in us that has to find a way to let that out if we want to live a meaningful and fulfilling life. And so right off the bat, Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. About 20 years later, after he taught his first message, one of Jesus's first kind of leader followers, after he had been crucified and resurrected and ascended to heaven, was the Apostle Paul. And he's writing to this church. It's actually second recorded letter in the scripture. It's probably one of many that he wrote to this particular group of people that were trying as best they could to follow Jesus in the middle of a major city that wanted nothing to do with the ways of Jesus. The city of Corinth was a powerhouse. It was where people went to make it. It's the Los Angeles or the New York City of Greece, it was full of all kinds of exciting things, all kinds of new business ventures, all kinds of craziness. And there are this little group of people in the middle of that city trying to live the ways of Jesus. And Paul writes to them so many different times to challenge or to encourage or to say, hey, you missed it, you got to change it, you got to come back. And specifically in 2 Corinthians, which we don't know that's actually his second letter to that church, but the second one that we have in the scriptures that we have enough of, where he begins and ends his letter speaking to some grief and some kind of brokenness and poverty that he is experiencing in his own life, not just as a leader, but as a follower of Jesus. And it's so reminiscent to these first two verses of the Sermon on the Mount, the first two Beatitudes of blessed are those poor in spirit that know their need for God, and blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. And the Apostle Paul brings his story, his life, to the Corinthian church, to the believers there in Corinth, saying, you got to understand that this isn't like something to avoid. This is for all of us. And he starts out and he says this, to open this letter in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 4. It says, he, meaning God, comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort others. For when they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort that God has given to us. And so he begins his letter by saying, those of you that are in this community, remember, this is what Jesus was trying to create. This was the kind of community that Jesus wanted us to be, that we welcomed those who were grieving, welcomed those who were mourning, and we were the hands and feet. We were the comfort of God in their life. The comfort we've received, we offer to others. And then at the end of that letter, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10, he has been talking about this pain. He calls it a thorn in his flesh, that he has asked God multiple times to take this pain away. He has this thorn in his flesh. I don't think it's literal. I think it's just a reference of just something that was driving him crazy. So for those of you that are parents right now for the last 6 weeks in quarantine, you know what he's talking about, right? You have this thing that just won't stop nagging you, right? And so this is what Paul says, and he says 3 different times, I begged the Lord to take it away, right? He's just honest. I've asked God to get this out of my life. And God said no. Each time, God responds to the Apostle Paul saying, my grace is all you need. Exactly what we talked about last week. That this thing that you want to get rid of, God says, I'm not going to necessarily get rid of that thing for you. But I'm going to teach you how to live with it and trust me through it. And this is powerful, powerful verse for us right now in our present circumstance. He says, my grace is all you need. My power, God speaking, my power works best in weakness. And so Paul tells the Corinthian church, so now I'm glad to actually boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me in an even greater way. And that's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses. I'm no longer trying to hide them, and I'm no longer trying to divert your eyes to some other part of my story. I'm just going to step out and be my authentic self, flaws and all, right? And he says, I'm going to take the insults, the hardships, the persecutions, whatever troubles I suffer for Christ. I'm going to take them all on because, and he closes with this, for when I am weak, then I'm actually strong. That what the Apostle Paul is trying to get the Corinthian church to understand, what I want us to understand together as a community, what I think Jesus meant for us to understand, is that at the end of ourself is when our life with Jesus begins. That when we are at the end of ourself, that is when our life with Jesus actually begins. And again, this is so counterintuitive to what it is that we have been taught in our culture, or maybe even by our families, in our careers, that you got to make it happen. That you got to hide your flaws and focus on your strengths. That you got to, make it on your own, that you're an individual and that everything is on your own. And if you don't do it, who will? And all of those things that are subtle and even overt messages in our culture. And yet the way of Jesus, it's crazy. And it's crazy now as it was then, where it says actually, when you make yourself less, when you recognize that you have a deficit, a gap that you can't fulfill, that not just in your own life with others and relational world, but specifically in our connection with God, that when you feel like you're out for the count, God says, that's when I count you in. That when you feel like life has dealt you a painful and difficult card, and grief is knocking at your door, something that you would never have asked for, and you don't know how to walk through, Jesus says, actually in the community of people that are following me, that we're going to be blessed when we mourn, because we're going to sense the comfort of God from all of these people around us. And so my encouragement for you this week, as we wrestle with this, we try to live this out together, a couple small things I want to just challenge you is actually on our website this week, we created a new kind of page that we want to actually live this idea of being those who comfort because we've been comforted by God, to live this out. That we would actually engage with the needs of one another. In fact, in the very first collection of stories about the very first church there in Jerusalem, the book of Acts chapter 2, it says there wasn't a needy person among them. That did not mean that people that were not rich were not allowed in, but in fact the very opposite. The people looked around and said, what do I have that someone else might need? I want to make sure that they're not lacking when I have extra. And so on our website, we've created on our care page at restorationchurchsd.com/care, a place where you can actually say, hey, I need a hand, or you can say, hey, I can lend a hand. That you can need a hand and lend a hand. And our hope is that this would become a living and active place as we empower you to literally love and follow Jesus by loving and following up with the needs of others in our community and around our city, that you might be able to do something that you didn't even realize someone else that you know actually needs. It's a place for you to communicate, hey, I actually need some help moving, or I need some help, I'm going to the hospital, or someone I know has just passed away, or someone else I know is struggling because they've lost their job. And others of us can say, hey, I can offer to help, or hey, I can offer to pray, or I can offer to give some financial support, whatever it might be. That we want to be the kind of community that lives out this idea that we are comforters because we have been comforted by God. That when we are at the end of ourselves, that's when our life with Jesus actually begins. And that together, all of us have a place and a role to play because we are empowered by the Spirit of God to live this crazy way of life that Jesus invited his first followers to 2,000 years ago, and that he is still inviting and calling you and me into today. And so perhaps for some of you, you've never really understood that that's what Jesus was inviting you to be a part of. That this was his kind of invitation to climb up a mountain and to hear some crazy things and to say, you know what, as different as that sounds compared to what culture says, it resonates so deeply in my soul, I want to be a part of that. And so maybe for you this week, this is a new step for you to say, I want to begin following Jesus. Maybe for you this week, you've been a church person for a long time, but you've never really realized that this is what it meant. And there's some areas of weakness, or there's some areas of unprocessed grief that have left you feeling unfulfilled in your life because you've tried to mask them or hide them or keep them to the side because you thought people didn't want to see them, and certainly God didn't want to have anything to do with them. And yet Jesus says, this is where you find my blessing, is when you bring your full self to the table. In fact, the last night that he was alive, he gathered those that were left amongst his followers. Many, many people at this point, as it got more and more dangerous to follow Jesus, had already left. But the last few that were still there, he gathered them around a table, and he brought his weakness before them. And he says, actually, in just a few hours, my body is going to be broken, and my blood is going to be poured out because I'm going to be arrested and murdered, not just because of what people have said about me, because of these crazy things I've said, but actually because of what is true about me, and the craziest thing that I said, which was that Jesus actually is the Son of God. He actually claimed to be God in the flesh here on the planet in order to bring us back into relationship with God in heaven. And that was crazy, that was heretical, that got him killed. And yet when he said to his followers there at the table, this is my body can be broken for you, and this is my blood, the only sinless blood to ever flow through human veins, it's going to be poured out for you. He actually says this is because this is how you and I come back into relationship with God. Nobody actually took his life from him. He offered it for us. He offered it for you. That his life was given, his body was broken, his blood was shed, because this is the new way that we have life with God, a new covenant, where brokenness is not something to be shed away, but it's something to be brought into blessing. That grief is not something that we have to hide, but it's something to process and to live openly and honestly. That our life is not any longer about me making much of myself and doing it on my own and proving that I'm better than others, but it's actually a place to say, when I'm bankrupt, when I'm out, when I feel empty, when I'm at the end of myself, that's actually where my life with Jesus really begins. And so as we celebrate communion together this morning, I would encourage you, would you grab some bread, grab some juice, some elements that you can just have in your house with whoever's there with you, and would you take a moment to simply remember the truth about who Jesus was, that he gave himself for you. The craziest thing that he said is that he would go to his death so that you and I could have life. He showed us what God is really like, and he showed you, and showed me, that we can come to him, that we can come to God through him because of his sacrifice. So that's what we remember when we celebrate communion. That's what we remember and celebrate together this morning. So why don't you take a moment with your family, whoever's gathered there with you, to pray, to celebrate communion together, to eat the bread, to drink the juice, and then we're going to continue to worship together in our gathering today. Thanks for being here.